that, again, this goes to my thought that God is needing something in this. And what he needs is, he needs this authentic faith that we've talked about. And I'm just going to throw this out there. I don't know how it'll land, but I'll throw it out there anyway. What God needs is our forgiveness. That is to say, he needs Job to carry this burden and say that it was worth it, because God is in pain over his creation. And it's a parent who has a child who's suffering. And you need to know that in some sense it was okay. It was all right. Mm. And you need to hear that from the child, because otherwise it's intolerable to produce that pain.
Yeah, I wanted to say I really enjoyed that video that you did. I watched it twice.
Yeah. Oh, too. Good. I'm glad you like that. It's given me an idea about how I might do more stuff on Elliot, because I constantly am hearing things that people say. It's like, oh, I know that line from that verse. I could talk about that for 20 minutes. And it allows for a kind of connection that people can kind of hook onto. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll do some more of that.
Yeah.
In fact, one on the wisdom poem in Job has come to mind. In fact, so I'm nice. Really kind of, my schedule's kind of clogged up right at the moment, but it'll come out. Mm-hmm. And you, Shari, and I really appreciate a lot of the insights that you bring and the kind of emotion you attach to things. It's been rewarding for me to listen to you talk, for sure.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I often wonder if anybody's listening. Well, people, I've often had the experience just growing up, even as a kid, that I would say something and everyone would go,
"What?"
And then I'm like, oh, did I say something wrong? Or was it like, yeah, it was always confusing to me, actually. And I was just talking to Jess a little bit about that this morning.
I know that experience. I'll come out of a movie with a group of people and I'll kind of hint at an idea that I had about it. And they're all like, "You're thinking about that stuff while you're watching the movie?" I'm like, yeah. Oh yeah, it turns out I am.
Connections. That's, yeah, when I was talking to Jess this morning about it, I was talking about poetic relations, right? And how poetic relations and symbolos, the word symbolos means being thrown together, which is for me a really good description of incarnation, right? Mm-hmm. When something from heaven inhabits something on the earth, right? And I say something because I think incarnation is a bigger concept. And I think that because of poetry, right? Because that's what poetry does. It takes something ethereal, an idea, a feeling, a thought, and to me, those are all connected to the word. And it makes it flesh, right? The word made flesh. Absolutely. So, right. And those are poetic relations. And so when you think in those terms on a regular basis, then you're not thinking probably like most people.
Yeah. One of the hard things for me through much of my life in terms of this little area is something that you guys kind of, a good version of inspiring me to know that it doesn't always have to be this way, has been that in the past, I've, when I talk about things and I talk about the ideas that I have about things, it comes out very abstract. It comes out very much as ideas. And yet what I'm really talking about is the direct kind of emotional experience a primary emotional experience of whatever it was that I was talking about, a poem or a movie or something like that. And that ability to recognize and sympathize with the idea that what's coming out of my mouth, the ideas that I've been kind of running through my head are really just kind of an enthusiastic afterglow, if you will, of the primary experience, is hard for some people to get. When I would hear Jess read Job and crack up a little bit, it really is. That's a kind of an important thing for me that it's real.
Yeah, it is important. This is something that I've just because I learned by doing this, having conversations. So it's kind of like I really sympathized with Jordan Peterson when he said he's just thinking out loud. And so I've been starting to realize that speech, articulation comes from feeling. And then and when I thought about it more, I thought, that's really, I don't know why I didn't think of that sooner, because cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the go-to for, helping people with psychological problems, it's the triangle of behavior, thought, and feelings. And in that triangle, the most difficult thing to change is your feelings. And the easiest thing to change is your behavior. And so what they do, because most people who, let's say you're depressed, so you're having feelings of depression, and out of that feeling, you live, right? You move from that feeling out into the world. And so what they do is they say, well, if you can't get off the couch, if you've been on the couch for 2 weeks, how about today you decide to make a coffee and only make it the goal that you get off the couch and walk to the coffee machine, right? You don't even have to make it. You just have to get there. And then, so you're making these little tiny baby steps. And I know this because I had to do it. Okay. And in the process, your feelings are being changed because you're starting to feel like you successfully made it to the coffee machine. So there's a slight elation, right, in your feelings as it's elevated. And so what happens after the behavior changes is the thoughts change, right? And then the feelings change. And that's that triangle. And I mean, it makes all the sense in the world why people say you have to have practices, right, of some kind, because those practices are what motivate you to think differently and to feel differently. But anyway, I don't want to do a whole thing on CBT, but we really do speak from our feelings. And what I find so fascinating about that is that feelings are not graspable, right? They're spirit in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually, in an important way. The kind of way in which emotion is distinct, let's say, from thought, is that emotion happens to us. Emotion comes on us. Emotion is something that is, in its essence, at least at its initiation, is something that comes on us, and we're not really in control of it. And in fact, that's kind of part of what it means for it to be, if you will, an emotion, is that it's kind of directly unmediated experience. And so that then makes it kind of maybe often is not this way, but sometimes that can be kind of terrifying, or completely you lose control. So one of the, you're talking about techniques for kind of framing and putting the emotions in a kind of container, maybe, or a way of managing it. And in a certain way, I would talk about my experience with Job and and the way I think about it and the relationship between the way I think about it and the way I experience it emotionally is as an example of what you're just talking about there. Because when I first read it, when I read, Job 3, for example, what it's doing is bringing forth that pathos of that moment, which isn't the interpretation of Job. It's not what we end up with. It's not where we end up, but it is, kind of deeply important and very directly experienced. And it kind of validates that. But not only that, you feel connected to the broader human community by kind of recognizing yourself in it and feeling it essentially in communion with others. And in a certain sense, that doesn't have anything to do with how you interpreted Job in the end. And then, of course, that's true for all the different parts of it. So,
yeah. Well, I've kind of talked about it as like the whole middle section of Job. There's this movement that takes place, or movements that take place within Job and within his friends. And we've talked, in our conversation, Jim, we talked about like recognizing those things like in myself as I'm like in conversations with people, and then like that whole middle section, it's so long and drawn out, and people don't have patience for it. But that's kind of how suffering is. Suffering is always long and drawn out. No one has the patience for it. No one has the time for it. But there's these movements that happen, and I when I read it and I reread it and I'm going through it again, like I'm trying to like resonate with those movements as they happen, and sort of you don't read it through like a lens of like, interpretation or trying to get some sort of systematic theology or the structure of heaven or whatever. Like really you're just trying to empathetically resonate with Job as he goes through this, and even resonate with the friends as they go through what they're going through. And then I find that like I'll notice those things in myself, and it actually sort of buttresses my own experience in different ways. And then I can recognize that in other people as I'm having conversation, and I'm able to encourage people in ways that I hadn't been able to before, because like I'll recognize things. I'll be like, like, oh, I saw that before. I wouldn't have noticed it before, that shape, that whatever you're talking about. And I can interact with it in a way that I feel like somehow my eyes have kind of been like open just a touch to something a little bit deeper about people and
patterns
through like hardship. Yeah.
I made a comment with you, Jess, when we talked, and then Anselman responded to that, and it kind of it was a good comment. I appreciated it, but it showed me something about my interpretations of things, which is that I don't really believe any of that stuff. I don't believe the stuff that I say. And I kind of say that tongue in cheek, but it's really kind of true. It's like a thing I put together in my head, and it's like a costume I put on, or it's like, how does this fit? Does this work?
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure I believe it, if whatever that means. But it's a way of kind of creating a framework of putting the pieces in the places that I think they might belong. And then maybe I'll change that. Maybe it'll modify, or maybe I'll say, well, it's close, but doesn't take everything into account, or something like that. But anyway,
because sometimes you don't know how you feel about something until you say it with some sort of conviction, and then you're like, no. Now that I said it, like, not. I don't even know. I think I'm full of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that gets right back to what I was talking about before, about how, you change your behavior, that changes your thoughts, and then your feelings are last, right? The idea that, and I think belief is a feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we say believe something, we're like, okay, so what is that? How do you believe? Nobody can talk about that.
Yeah.
I couldn't. I can't describe belief. What is it?
Yep.
What is it? it's a feeling, right?
Mhm.
So, yeah, like I really do think that we need to stumble around a lot with our speech, and I also think that a lot of Christians are afraid to do that because they're afraid of
Yeah.
hell.
Yeah. Afraid they might say something that's
right?
not supposed to be said. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is like Luke
Yeah.
Thomas's thing about confessionalism. When you have a confession be sort of the cornerstone of like what saves you, like it's not just like the cornerstone of the institution or the, it's like if you believe this, you are saved, and if you don't, then you're not saved. Like there's these existential ramifications for, you know, having the right words, and so there's a place for speaking correctly and saying what is true, but also there's this way that it can work against you, because like you have to say what's true, like that you get into this, which is why I like the book of Job, is because there's parts in it where he's not theologically correct, but he's completely honest. He's completely forthright and true to how he sees things and how the experience of what he's going through is. And God even confirms that at the end. He's like, what Job spoke was right. And you look back through the speeches, you're like, it wasn't right on like a systematic theology level. It was right on this other level where he's speaking exactly what he sees.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, you know, like it's become, the older I get, the more apparent it is to me that, you know, we really refrain, at least I do, from saying what I really feel, because to do that would to make me vulnerable to someone else, right? Because most of the time I'm feeling confused, or I'm feeling hurt, or I'm feeling misunderstood, you know. So we take a defensive posture, and even with God, and I don't know, maybe it's the Holy Spirit working, but I'm just in this place at the moment where God's like, is that really, is that my I think it was my niece said to my sister one time, or my daughter said something like, I'm just saying it the nice way, you know? So we develop these ways to keep ourselves safe, right? To talk about things in ways, even with our most intimate partners and with God. And Job doesn't have that. Like this is the thing about Job that I love so much. You know, he just tears away all the veils, right? There are no more veils. And he says things that, like when he says maybe there's life after death, you know, we all go, well, of course there is, right? But think about that. Like, put yourself in his shoes, right? Maybe there's, like, it's just outrageous to say that, and to say that within that context with those people is to make yourself so vulnerable, right? Suddenly you're just like a little stupid kid, right? And he was what? The wisest man in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the king, right?
I have to run. But if I want to hear you guys talk about the relationship between George MacDonald and T.S. Eliot.
Ooh, okay.
But you don't want to hear it when you're here. You just want to hear it later.
but I gotta go do stuff. All right. I'll be back in a little bit, but please continue.
Make it quick.
All right, Shari.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, give me an idea and see if it inspires something.
Yeah, same here actually. Well, I was listening to your video, okay, and you were reading the excerpts. I heard it the first time, and it just kind of floated over me, which is normally what happens when I hear something for the first time, and then I'll dig in and watch it again, and I watched it the second time, and I heard Rose Fire in one of the excerpts that you were reading, and I'm like, ding, I'm like, that's a George MacDonald word. Wait a minute.
So tell me how he uses that, because I'll tell you, the entire poem ends with the concept of the fire and the rose. In fact, the last line of the poem is,
oh, wow. I haven't even read it yet. I haven't had time.
Yeah, the very last line of the poem is, let's see. Well, I'll just read from here. This line that I'm going to start with is echoed in the very beginning of the poem,
okay.
and then it goes into something else. Quick now, here, now, always. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. When the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one.
Yeah.
So you have to, I mean, obviously there's a lot that comes before that builds into that moment, but this fire, this notion of the fire as, you know, the Pentecostal fire, and the fire as the, you know, kind of burning, purifying fire. And of course, fire as a source of pain and suffering are all kind of, you know, one thematic thing that runs through the poem and culminates in the idea of somehow those things coming together in a redemptive mode or a redemptive sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I can say about George MacDonald, and he uses the image of the rose fire often in his fairy tales. Trying to think, I think in the Wise Woman, she sits in front of a rose fire.
No, when you say rose fire, is he referring to something in particular?
It's roses with the
yep.
in the fireplace that are giving her heat. It's a rose.
It's like fire. The petals are actually flames.
Yeah, yeah. It's a fire made of roses, and so it was interesting. Okay, so then he has a sermon called "Our God is a Consuming Fire," and in that sermon, he lays out in a very strong way, his universalist perspective.
Mm-hmm.
He's a universalist, George MacDonald. Okay. And this is why T.S. Eliot says, and in the end, all shall be well.
Well, right.
Right.
Yep.
And so what's interesting about the way T.S. Eliot's using that imagery of the rose fire is that he's using it to indicate, excuse me, a reconciliation of opposites. Right.
Yes. That's
so the
exactly
rose,
right.
The rose is something that's beautiful and has a beautiful odor and so on. And the fire is all the things we know about fire. So George MacDonald, I listened recently to a few lectures from the Wade Center, and the guy is a specialist in George MacDonald, and he was talking about the image of the rose fire, and he said I think it's his son's biography of his father and mother. He tells the story of how one of the kids picked roses from the garden. One of George MacDonald's children picked his mother's roses from the garden and brought them in the house. And George MacDonald took the roses and he threw them in the fire. Okay. And his son, the child, was bawling. And he was standing there. And at that moment, he had this epiphany, okay, of the love of the Father. How that works itself out, because he's got all these things going on, right? He's got this child that he loves, that he's punished, who's suffering. He's thrown the beautiful roses into the fire and they're being consumed, right? And he's standing there as the arbiter of justice and mercy, right? All at once. And the whole thing is just playing out in front of him. And according to the biographer, this was the impetus for the rose fire, right? Because it was a picture to George MacDonald of the love of the father for his child, right? So the father knows that he can't let the child get away with picking the roses. Obviously, he was told never to do it, and he did it.
Never
Right?
to
He
pick the roses,
disobeyed.
yeah.
And for George MacDonald, obedience is everything, right? If you're not obeying God, you haven't understood anything. And so, and his use of universalism is really, really interesting. Jedediah said one time, the one thing about George MacDonald that's kind of hard to grasp is his severity as a universalist, like the severity of his message. And one of the things he says all the time is you have to pay back the uttermost farthing, right?
Yeah, Elliot's not a preacher in the sense that trying to get some sense, like you're talking about, of a theological posture is a little difficult. But at the same time, he's also a guy who, he's a guy who has had a lot of pain, or at least it seems like, if you just try to kind of embrace his personality, he's got a kind of tragic sensibility about him. And there's a lot of kind of sense that he needs to lament, that he needs to bring out that pain.
Yeah.
And so when he does that, I think he's looking for ways in which that can be transformed, the ways in which that can be, kind of redemptively transformed. And I think symbols like fire are that kind of thing for him. And so he'll bring that in the poetry. I'm not sure you can put it together in like a kind of direct theological way of him being a universalist and then the fire being purifying and all of that. But I think he definitely uses the symbol or the idea of it in that very way to kind of lament or emote and have it come to a point where it's transformed into a positive valence, transformed into something that shows life and our experience as something we affirm and something we are fully embracing with faith and
yeah. Well, I mean, I should add that for George MacDonald, the fire is the love of God, and God's love is experienced by those who love him as love, and those who are not in communion, let's say, with God, as fire, right? So he has this line, I don't know if I can say it off by heart: love loves unto purity, and that which is not lovely, it strives to make more lovely, right? And so it spends itself. And so he sees this fire as, this is why the sermon starts out as our God. He uses the verse, our God is a consuming fire, because it will consume everything that is not lovely, right? Yeah. Everything that comes between it and God, right, will be consumed. And that will be experienced as either pain or love, depending on the person. And that is what he saw when he stood there with his child, right? He saw the fire consuming, but that consuming of the roses by the fire was out of love for the child. Like, imagine the moment. I don't know. I like to think about it as standing there and imagining what was going through his mind, at that time. And I mean, he also didn't have a very great life like George MacDonald. He had a lot of kids, but he was always very poor and he struggled with, I don't know if he had tuberculosis, but he had lung disease anyways, for sure. And
yeah,
so quite
Elliot's
sickly.
life was not, his life, he had a very difficult marriage, and the marriage turned out to be a very painful thing for him for a long time. He was also a man of the, kind of World War I/World War II generation, which obviously carries all the kind of seriousness of that. And he was, I think, for much of his life, he was kind of a lonely guy. Later in his life, he makes a relationship that kind of in the vein of C.S. Lewis, makes a relationship that ultimately, kind of gives him a whole new kind of perspective on possibilities in personal life. But so he didn't suffer in the kind of physical sense, but he certainly had a painful kind of relationship in his 20s and 30s that I think colored a lot of his viewpoint as well.
Yeah. Did you have the opportunity to read that essay at all?
I did. I did.
You?
Yeah, and it intrigues me to. One of the things about Elliot is that he is a guy who's steeped in literature and in the tradition, and so it would not surprise me in the least. In fact, I would have to read and find these things, but he picks things out of other writers just at will and drops them into his text. And one of the kind of fun practices of reading Elliot is to try to find those things, to find those
little
those
Easter
things.
eggs.
And it would be very interesting to read, say, MacDonald's fairy tales, or I would not be surprised if I didn't find a whole bunch of stuff that he might have pulled right out of there.
Well, according to the essay that I sent you, a lot of the imagery in Four Quartets was taken from Lilith by George MacDonald, the novel. And it was his last work. It was George MacDonald's last work, and kind of his crowning glory, in my opinion. I mean, his fairy tales, everything I think everything he wrote was great, but that's
and Elliot's doing this with all sorts of things. And I think maybe even one section of Job, which I'll try to make that case in this little video I was talking about. But he is both explicitly picking things up, so he'll put quotes in that are explicitly from a certain prior work, but he'll also he'll imply things. And it wouldn't be surprised if sometimes he pulls things out and doesn't necessarily attribute them and just uses them because he thought it was beautiful or he thought it was the right way to phrase things.
Yeah.
And he's just doing that all the time. In fact, it's one of the central things that he's all about, in a way. Is kind of borrowing, if you will. Well,
I mean, according to George MacDonald's imagination essay, that's what we do. We recombine. And he actually shows in the essay, he's got three, I don't know if it's poetry. I think it's poetry, lines of poetry over time, describing the same thing and borrowing. So the first one is original, and then the other one borrows, and the other one borrows again, right?
Elliot has a place in a lot of different things in the 20th century. And one of them is that he was an important part of the development of literary theory in the 20th century. He wrote an essay called, what's it called? Tradition and the Individual Talent is the name of the essay. But basically what he argues in that is that you can't really say anything that isn't tied to the past, that isn't tied to the tradition, that comes from somewhere, the influence of history on you. And that by then saying that, putting that into your own words, or even not putting it in your own words, or just quoting it, you are modifying it. You are modifying the sense in which it is taken. Right. And so that, in a sense, will change. He goes to an extreme of saying something like, well, that even changes the history of it. That even changes the way
it does.
You can possibly interpret the original text.
Yeah.
And, there's many examples of this. He takes the first line of the Canterbury Tales, which is, a set of verses about how April flowers come from spring showers. I can't remember the quote exactly, but he then modifies that in one of his first big poems, which was called Wasteland, in which he says April is the cruelest month. And he's referencing that very line in the Canterbury Tales, but he's obviously changing it in the way in which it's contextualized. And this is a kind of way in which he writes a lot of what he does.
Right.
And I wouldn't be too surprised if he did that with MacDonald in places.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find. I just clicked on my link for my my essay here, and it's a different web page, so I don't know what happened.
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring that up myself.
Because I wanted to look at that place where he does that. Oh, look at this! It's not coming up. This web page. Maybe they're doing something there. Yeah, well, it was interesting to me because I realized then why you used the quotes in your video that I had, you know, those clips of me, because I was actually speaking from George MacDonald's point of view.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the snowdrop because that's specifically referred to in there. And so that gave me the real good hook to be able to, you know,
yeah. And it's funny because you're hearing Elliot.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing MacDonald.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, T.S. Eliot and George MacDonald. And then a whole bunch of things came up and I read that one essay.
And this idea that you and Nate were talking about, I think is really key. And I said this in my video as well, is this notion that things have a kind of, things have real essences of their own. I think we live in this kind of this modern, you know, kind of materialistic, reductive materialism in which, you know, everything's flattened out and all things are made of biochemical molecules or atoms and all that. And that's a very flattening kind of sense. And Elliot it's really important in Elliot. A lot of what he does is try to evoke the things in our world as being part of a full living rational order, and that things are manifestations of reality. Things are manifestations of real, essentially spiritual notions. So a rose is not, you know, is a fragile, a snowdrop is a fragile beauty, and that is a fragile beauty is a real thing in the world. It's a real thing that we experience. And if you start to notice that, you're starting to fill the world out with all of its real depth. And, well,
I like to think of it as that creation is it's telling a story, but it also is the story.
Absolutely.
Right. So like the way that MacDonald describes the snowdrop, when he says science can tear it apart, but they'll never see that it's talking about hope and pale, confident submission. Right.
Yeah.
Because it's poking out of the snow. All odds are against it. Its little head is hanging down, you know, and it's pale in every sense of the word. And yet it's confident that spring is coming, right? Because it's the first thing that shows up. It's like the crocus. And
Elliot does the same thing. In one of the third of the four quartets is a water themed poem in which he starts talking about a river and he moves towards talking about the ocean, and he's really using them in their very essence of, you know, rivers as a linear an expression of linearity of time and progression of our experience from one moment to another, and the ephemeral transience of our present, you know, position in that flow of time, and then moves towards the ocean, which is, I mean, there's a line that says the river is within us and the ocean, he uses the word sea, and the sea surrounds us. You know, with the image of it as eternal and occupying all corners, and he develops that whole notion of the real essence of these things that are ever present in our lives that have both kind of immanence in the sense that we experience them directly. It's not like the river is something foreign to us or anything, but it has in it the very reality of things transcendent, essentially. And
right, this is exactly what MacDonald is talking about when he says that the forms, like the imagination for him, the imagination lights the lamp within the forms, and the forms are everything in nature that assails the senses, everything. So things you see and things you don't see, the wind, for example. Right. And those things are created ex nihilo by God. So we don't create ex nihilo. We recombine things. And he says, you know, you can create a little world of your own. But for him creation is ex nihilo. And when God makes the thing, he puts the meaning in it. It contains the meaning, right? So then he can go on to say that the world is the human being turned inside out. And so then he goes on, he describes how a man is searching for a word for something, and he looks around him and he sees it. He sees something in nature, and he uses that to clothe his thoughts, right? And I love how he puts it. He says the man searches, diligently for something to describe his feelings, and there stands his thought. And then he says, God thought it before him, right? So
yeah, and I think that, it is the way, a lot of people have this intuition, and I think Elliot, without being explicit about it, was doing this, but
but
certainly Barfield, the way I hear people talk about Barfield and Lewis were this kind of idea of returning to a pre-modern kind of sensibility about the world. Elliot is doing a lot of that. I mean, he is.
Well, it's what poetry does, in my opinion, right? It's what poetry does, and this is why I started out by saying that it is the word made flesh. Like, this is what poetic relations are, right? So then the world stops being outside of you and divided away from you, and it becomes actually a reflection of you to you. But it is the thing that with which you clothe your thoughts, right? That which you create from, even if it's concrete. Like, concrete is made out of the elements of the earth, right?
Dust. I mean,
everything.
We can say dust, and then everyone will turn in. It's just inert molecules. But in a pre-modern sense, there was the inert, but it was in contrast to the breath. It was in contrast to fire. It was in contrast to water. It was in contrast to the heavens, the celestial higher presence surrounding us. And so a cosmos is much different than a universe. It's a kind of fully embodied, incarnate collection and ordered collection of real presences of the variety and well-ordered variety of our experience. And to miss that is to miss a lot.
Yeah. This is what I was talking to Jess about, because we end up living in a world where everything is divided, in the sense that we don't see it being thrown together in relationship to each other poetically, right? There's a great scene in one of George MacDonald's fairy tales called The Castle, where the elder brother, who is represented or symbolic of Christ, the elder brother takes the elder sister to the window, and he tells her to look out the window. And at first she just sees a landscape and bright light. And then suddenly she sees the sky touching the mountaintops. And she falls on her knees and starts weeping, right? And then she gets a glimpse, and she thinks, so they're a bunch of children living in a castle, and there's the elder brother and the elder sister. The elder brother is Christ. And the father is absent, and he's coming back someday, but they never know when, right? And they're waiting for him. And so suddenly she thinks she sees the father coming from between the place where the sky and the earth meet, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that is poetic relations, right? That's it. Yep. Like, we see the sky as something above and the earth as something below, but she caught that picture of them actually touching, right?
Yeah. And this is not a new idea to me, but we are that bridge between heaven and earth in that we have the breath, in in us, the image of God.
Well, yeah. And I think we actually throw it together in conversations like this, and in poetry like Elliot's, and in fairy tales like MacDonald's, right? This is where we throw it together.
It makes me, like I listened to one discussion of Job, and I won't even mention who was doing this, but was kind of got onto the hook of, when was it written, and the textual analysis of it, and the controversies, the arguments about, is it a unified text or are there multiple texts? Spend an hour and a half talking about that stuff, which is kind of to some degree interesting, but it just misses the entire thing. I mean, they didn't talk about the poetry of it at all. And it's so easy to kind of spend a lot of mental effort on things and just miss everything.
Yeah.
That was in my first conversation with Paul, actually, was my experience with the Jordan Peterson. Not necessarily a full-on fan of Jordan Peterson, but when the biblical series was coming out, it really struck me that both sides of the ledger can experience the text of the Bible, let's say, as an object to scrutinize and basically miss the whole thing and not experience it emotionally. And here I'm talking about both sides of the ledger: an atheist who's looking at it and debunking it by looking at all of the aspects of it that seem to be falsifiable.
Right. And
then the religious, a certain brand of religious discussions, constantly looking for proof texts and ways of verifying it against the onslaught of the secular world. And neither one of them are reading the text, and neither one of them are experiencing the text.
They're treating it as an object. Yeah. It's interesting because McGilchrist talks about this quite a bit. I think his very first book, which he says never did well, and he was quite a bit younger when he wrote it, is called Against Criticism. And it's for that very reason.
Yeah.
Because what it does is divide, right? And when you divide the thing up into pieces, you lose sight of the whole thing, and then it's gone. You can't see it anymore, right? And this is why I think it's so interesting. Like when I talked to Martin Shaw, one of the things that I got out of going to his performance, or whatever you call it, I went to one of his storytelling things, was I was reminded how primitive, how people for millennia have been sitting around fires listening to stories. And that was church. Okay. So they made sense of the world through myth. And then I'm like, well, that's what the Bible is. It's a story, right? And it starts out with this fantastic creation story, and how, a human is made of the dust. And I mean, and it ends with Revelation. I mean, the whole thing is a dream, right? It's like a dream. And we're treating it like some kind of scientific work that has to be scrutinized and criticized and torn to pieces. And then it loses, in my opinion, it loses all life, because it's no longer it's not breathed. And I think breathed is when something is, it's like, it's what happens when the storyteller opens his mouth. And George MacDonald calls that being born of the spirit and not of the flesh. Yeah. Right. When you take those poetic relations and you breathe life into them, right? Like, this is why I think.
Do you think you just have to have a certain sensibility or a certain disposition to kind of feel that, or is it teachable? Or I don't know.
I think so. Like I was talking to Jess about this morning. Traditionally speaking, every society has had its shaman, right? And I think those are the people who somehow have the ability to see the relationships as incarnational, right? With the natural world. And because they have that ability to see that, they can bring healing, because when you see things like that, you see them reconciled. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing a reconciliation of sorts, right? This is what Symbolos is for me. It's a bringing together. And that always is mercy, healing, reconciliation, poetic relations. To me, they're all the same thing, because what they do is they knit two things together. And that's what healing is. So if you have that ability to see the world that way, and you speak that out, as Tomberg would say, that's sacred magic. It's an articulation of contemplation and rumination on something. And you have the ability to speak it out, sacred magic, you bring healing into the world. You just do. Right? So, I mean, I don't want to say only some people can do that, because I think that, you know, even for Judaism, in the world to come, no man will need to teach another man anything, right? So there will be a sense of this oneness or this unity in the world. But I said this to Dominic in our last conversation, that I think what's happened is that in an effort to unify, and that's really a militant statement for me, it's political, right? It means everybody has to be on the same page. And I mean, if you've had a family with at least 2 children, just try that. Like, so, violence will erupt. Okay, it will. So,
yeah, I don't know if this fits the context, but Sam's. I don't know if you listened to Sam's recent video.
No, I didn't know. No.
He describes, and I don't think I'm telling stories out of school, he describes his difficulties with his present church and on confessional grounds. And I won't go into any more of it than that, but it basically came to a head, and he is dealing with that he's no longer under the confession of his present congregation, and he's no longer attending that church or being able to participate in that. And you should listen to his expression of this. It's very heartfelt and touching. But I left that discussion. He talks about it for half an hour longer, and I'm like, what is the use of that at all for anybody? How did that help anybody? The people in the congregation, Sam, his family, you know, no one is helped by that. That nothing good comes from that. And I don't know what the alternative is. You know, can we be completely non-confessional? I personally kind of feel that way myself. I'm not sure that can work in reality, but boy, that didn't feel good.
Well, there are non-confessional Unitarian churches, and Sam doesn't like them, which is, you know, like, that's the Universalist Unitarian.
That's the thing. Yeah, that's right. That's what I mean by maybe it's not practical. Maybe it doesn't work. I don't know.
Yeah. I have thoughts, but I won't say them. But what was I getting at? What was I talking about before? I can't remember now exactly.
Bringing together,
sorry about
symbolic
that.
Right?
Yeah. I lost my train of thought there, but
yeah, I threw a bomb right in the middle there.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, I know. I was going to talk about, you know, in our efforts to be unified, which I think
you're talking about unity.
You know, everybody thinks unity is great, but the Bible is a story about that wasn't so great, right? It's called the Tower of Babel. So it's like, there's a warning there. There's a warning about unity, because not all unity is unity, right? Not all unity is the same. And what I get a sense of is that we try to collapse the particular into the unity. And what ends up happening is we end up with uniformity. We end up with confessionalism. Everybody has to sign under the dotted line, right? They all have to be on the same page. We see that even in the non-Christian world, right? In the secular world. But what happens if you collapse the unity into the particular? Like that is for me what the story that I understand being told in the Bible. That's the story that's happening there. And that is a poetic relation, right? When the micro and the macrocosmos are reconciled with each other, and the particularity of every person is preserved because it's important, and everything, right? Because we need it. We need, like, I live on a farm and I don't want everything to be a sheep, right? Because then my sheep would starve because there would be no grass, right? I don't want everything to be a chicken because that would drive me crazy. Right? So like diversity is, as a farmer, or someone who lives off the land, like, hunter gatherer or whatever, diversity is your friend. The more diversity that you find, and I'm not talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of diversity, not the one that you see with your eyes, but the one that you don't see with your eyes, right? Meister Eckhart has a really great quote for that. Maybe I'll find it after. But that's your friend. You look for places that are between places, between the dry land and the water, between the field and the forest, between, right? It's always those between places. And it's so interesting that George MacDonald uses that kind of language in The Castle. When the heavens come down to meet the earth, it's between them that the Father, she thinks she sees the Father come forth, So, yeah, I don't know. You were asked, I guess the reason I'm talking about this is because you were asking about, can you teach this to people? And I think you can't. I think people have to learn it. And this is also why I love the Book of Job, because I think the only way they learn it is through suffering. It's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
Because then they learn that things are not so cut and dry, right? Maybe they did everything right, and now everything is going wrong, and they don't know why, right? And they have to make themselves vulnerable, and they have to stamp their feet and cry like a little baby, because that's what God wants them to be, his children, right? His babies.
Yeah, I felt listening to you guys talk and then coming to my conversation with Jess that there was there was a kind of a charitable environment that would just allow for a conversation without any kind of, starting presumptions about what maybe I believe or, what ultimately Jess's theology behind it all would be, just on the basis of the intimate experience of it. And that does seem to be a method, at least as a starting point, to just, be able to let it have its impact on you and work through it and not take it for, some key, some puzzle that's going to ultimately, kind of solve all the problems or fit together to reinforce some pre-existing theological notions, understanding or something.
You mean the book itself?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. Like, I think you have to actually come to the book like Job, stripped of everything. Yeah. You really do. Like, you have to be naked and scraping yourself in the dust. Like, you have to let go. And I talked to Jess about this before, when I approached it the first time years ago, I remember thinking, because I rubbed up against some stuff and I was like, oh, okay, well, I have two options here. I can just shut the book and say I don't get it, or I can try to make it fit my propositional understanding of things, or I can pretend I don't know anything, right? And then go from there. And so it's a kind of stripping away of everything, right? And coming naked to the book. And I think that I got the deepest insights coming to it that way. For sure.
Do you would you want to talk about a specific thing in Job that
If you have
that
something, go for it.
All right. Well, Jess, you framed the book as a creation story, which I think is a very good way to think about it. And then God's speech to Job at the end seems to put Leviathan in this very important place. And then there's this, I think I said this to you before, Jess, there's this kind of break. It's like God doesn't really conclude his speech. He just stops kind of, or at least that's the way it feels to me. And maybe you can talk about that. What is the place of Leviathan for you in that? What is Job supposed to understand about Leviathan? I have my ideas, and they're going to be these ideas, like I said before, that just come to me, and aren't necessarily something I quite am committed to, but it's an idea that seems to come from the text for me. So I'll give that to you in a sec. But
there's like Leviathan corresponds with all kinds of things that, like, I'll hear a conversation between people talking about some subject, and I'll be like, oh, that's kind of like it, and that's kind of like it. Like you just sort of find where Leviathan is, and it's well, what started to unlock it for me was Jordan Peterson's, when he brought up the ancient idea of order and versus chaos kind of conflicting to create the world, and Marduk and Tiamat and whatever. And so that I was like, oh, so this is a creation story, and literally that's all God is talking about is creation. So it seemed like a no duh, but like you don't know that when you're reading it, because you're like, why is he talking about a monster? Because we don't have that categorized anymore. So it's within, like, a context of these other stories of these other dragons and these other deities fighting the dragons or whatever. But when God talks about Leviathan, he talks about it proudly as one of his creations. And so already you're on a different level. God's talking about it as his pet. And you're like, that's, first of all, it's terrifying and strange and uncanny. And then it's also just like, what is the point of that? And then, so then you have to draw all these parallels. You're like, well, it's obviously sort of the chaos that Job's been facing. And God's like, can you tame it? Can you take, and then it's also the internal turmoil that Job faces, his own emotions, his own crying out, like it's that too. It's also the onslaught of the accusations from his friends and from the people that he knew that now, they spit on him and call him names and all that stuff. So like, but it kind of does. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking, because I'm thinking about it in terms of McGilchrist, the way he talks about the necessity for tension, right? In order for something to be. And so couldn't you just say it's any kind of resistance? Like, so like you're talking about this resistance, maybe Leviathan you could call resistance itself, right? But it permeates everything fractally. So it's a resistance within the cosmos, within creation, within the man, within the community, within the family, right? It just kind of trickles all the way down. And it's through this resistance that things come into being, right? And I mean, some of the best physical therapy is resistance therapy, right? Where you don't actually try to build something from scratch, but you just push against what is, right?
Yeah.
And that makes you stronger.
I like what you just said there, except I want to use a different word than resistance. I want to use, like, what we were talking about before is fire or transformative intensity. If we start with the other creation stories in which there's a kind of bifurcation between chaos and order, or there's a pre-existent bifurcation of chaos and order, and chaos is overcome by order or whatever. Whereas God in Genesis, there's chaos, kind of undifferentiated, unordered, unformed chaos as the starting point. And if we're going to make order out of it, then that chaos, that force of transformation, that force of intensity, that force of fire and destruction even, has to be encapsulated. It has to be incarnated as a part of the entire order. It has to be so if we're going to make this macrocosm, microcosm, layered, ordered, orderly, rightly ordered cosmos, then that chaos is going to have to be it's going to have to be embodied. It's going to have to be and put over to the side in a sense. It's in the ocean. It's over there. It's got the shell, the scales on it. It's got a kind of form, an embodiment in Leviathan. So it's not controlled really, but it's put in its place, in its right place within the whole order. And that's what Leviathan is. And then I agree with you entirely, Shari, that then has this macrocosm, microcosm layering out because it's fractal in that sense. So it is in the overall ordering. It's in the microcosmic ordering. It's in our soul as well, but it's put in this embodied form of the Leviathan. And then that it's kind of, I don't know, this last sentence, maybe you will maybe push back on, but there's no creating a ordered cosmos without it. You can't have an ordered cosmos without that. I agree with that. Yeah. And that then is the transforming fire that we were talking about before. And I think it's the way in the 4-element view of the cosmos from the ancients: water, earth, fire, and air. Fire is that part of it. So anyway, that's my idea about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. The one thing I'm thinking about is because, I just made a video on it, but the tension, like Shari, you're talking about tension, but there's this tension within the book here between when God talks about Leviathan and then when he talks about the foundations of creation. And so I talk about that in terms of like because God invites Job to measure and to calculate the dimensions of the foundations of creation and where the pillars are sunk and how the cornerstone is laid. And so it's an engagement of the rational mind that's quickly sort of overwhelmed by how do you calculate the foundations of the world?
Right.
Like how do you, set in our scientific terms, like what's the initial action at the Big Bang that makes sure everything else happens in the fashion that it did? That protons and neutrons form and they're able to come into atoms, and then those build clouds, and there's gravity, and then forms a sun, and then all that stuff. Like how, like, can you calculate that? Can you put your rational mind to it? And we can get to a limit, and then quickly we're overwhelmed, and we're just like it overwhelms us. And so you also have that with Leviathan, and Leviathan is like that. It's like fight or flight. It's fear. It's awe. It's reverence. It's that which is transformative. So we can't see past it. Like it's that which works on us, and it's our emotions and the things that rise up within us. And so and quickly Leviathan is also overwhelming as well. And then God's like, I hold it all together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's, it's what McGilchrist talks about when he talks about the coincidence of opposites, and that there's a higher unity there. And he's like, can you see it, Job? And I think Job does see it, because he then immediately after this says, I know that you can do all things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had a thought about that, because I'm going to stretch everyone's imaginations here because when I first read that, I was like, I know you can do all things. It's like, oh, you're strong. You're, like, I remember being a kid in the playground and like, my dad's bigger than your dad. My dad can do all things, right? He can beat your dad up. And then I was listening to a few things and I thought, wait a minute, my dad can do all things. That means there's nothing outside of his purview, right? And we do have that, like you said, bifurcation, right, of chaos and order, or good and evil, and blah blah. We've got all this going on, right? But what if God does all things, right? And I don't know. I don't know if that's what Job's saying, but I like to think about it like that. I like to think that, because he says, I have heard of you, but now I have seen you, right? Right after that. So I know you can do all things, all of them. And the other thing that I'm thinking about when you guys are talking is that it's out of chaos that God derives order, right? So chaos, like, I just see it like this swirling pool of, buildings and tractors and tables and chairs, and
Inside the pool.
and God's like, well, here, we'll put that in the house. We'll put the house over here, and we'll do that, And so it's like, oh, chaos is actually full of potential. And that is true, right? For us, like when we enter a chaos, even in our own personal lives, that's the moment where we have the potential to do good or evil, right? To do something amazing, to transcend ourselves, right? It's only there, I think, that we create something incredible out of the chaos, right?
But
And that's
also
what God
just
does. And I just wanted to say this before I forget. The chaos, there's nothing said about what happens to that chaos. Like, is it still swirling around there? It must be, in a sense, right? Still, I mean, it's the sea. Where did I hear this recently? Oh, it was in anyway, I don't remember, but this was why in Revelation the crystal sea is crystal, because there is no more of that chaos, right? The sea is now crystal. And I was always thought about that crystal sea as when things become clear, crystallized, right? And right now you understand. So it's no longer this swirling mass of potential, but you look at it and you're like, oh, I get it. I see it now, right?
But also in the, for important part of this for me, and obviously Job is dwelling on this part of it as well. And that is when the pain is there, when almost the breath of Leviathan is burning your cherished, precious part of your experience. And you can then lament in full. You can shed the tears of that moment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And do it in the reality of the pain of it. Not in your sense, Shari, of authenticity about that pain. Fully, yes, this is worth saying, I wish I was never born.
Well, this is that child, right? Too.
Right. And do child. That and have that wail with lament and do it in the context, in that kind of ordered cosmos, within the ordered cosmos, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things Jess and I stumbled across in the book, at least I did, maybe for Jess it was obvious, but was the fact that so much of the book, even the structure of the book and so on, was birthing. There was a birthing metaphor happening there, right? And Jess said at one point,
God's speech.
Yeah, but like even in the beginning, like I remember when you said, what does a little baby do when it's born? And as soon as it's born, it just cries, right? And this is And I just
and so do the
recently read-
parents typically.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, it's, you know, one of the things that I personally believe is that the Bible is always talking about transformation. It's even when it's using language like destruction, when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, the caterpillar has been destroyed, right? It's now a butterfly. But where did it go away? No. It was incorporated into the butterfly itself. And the more I think about that, the more I realize that nothing goes away. Everything leaves its trace, right, in the world. And we're just moving from glory to glory, like this is what Paul says, right? It's a constant transformation. And even the destruction language is talking about something being
Creation,
transformed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what Jesus was talking about, like all the time, especially like even the rich young ruler. Like, well, the question is like, what do I do to have eternal life? Or he's like, I forget what the first question is, but it was like, what should I do to be good? And Jesus said, obey the commandments. And he said, I have. And he says, well, there's one thing you lack. Sell everything you have and follow me. And that's a death. And
Jesus, become something other than you are.
Yeah. And the thing is like, he's saying, if you want to have eternal life, learn how to die.
Yeah.
Because just as inevitable as death is, resurrection is there. Mm-hmm. And this is not an easy thing and being finite, you can't see through that. That's Leviathan. You can't see past the fires. All you can do is be like, all right, this is what I was told. I guess I'm going, but this is also why the Holy Spirit is sent to us, because the Holy Spirit is there to encourage us. And so like you see the Christian martyrs and saints be able to like go through things. You're just like, what are they talking? One Shari, who was it that was the one saint that was like, don't keep me from being born. He's like going to be
Saint Ignatius.
Saint Ignatius. He encouraged his followers who were weeping and stuff. He
was on his way to be martyred in Rome. Yeah. And he said, please don't hinder me from being born. Right. I am going to become human. That's what he said. I am going to become human. John Bear makes the point. Okay, so he's calling the living dead and he's calling them not human. What does this mean? Right. And
wow. I'm going to have to read that stuff. I have not heard that one before.
Oh no. Oh, I could send you some John Bear videos because they're amazing. But yeah, there's yeah, this is why it's so interesting that Job uses that same language, right? About being born. And didn't I just send you something recently? I've been I've been knitting. So when I'm knitting, I'm just listening to all kinds of stuff. And some saint said, it was Gregory of Nyssa, said that we're just embryos in the world. And in order to be born, we have to die. Right?
Oh my gosh.
That's St. Gregory of Nyssa said that. Yeah. So anyway, it's a deep, deep well, a deep, deep one. And I saw a comment on your latest video, Jess, from Nate, I think, and it said, you just keep mining this book for all kinds of things, right? And I said, Job 28, hello. Like,
that's literally what it says in there.
We're supposed to be doing that. That's why this book exists, right? Yeah. So that we just keep mining it, because it is the creation of a human being from the human being's perspective, right? What it means to be created. And if you follow what John Bear's talking about, it means dying, right? And so, and our life is one of, suffering, right? Because to get to the end of it, we're completely diminished. Like if we get to revel in being 80 or 90 or whatever, I don't know how, my mother-in-law is 92 and she's healthy. She's perfectly healthy. She lives on her own and everything, but she just keeps saying, oh, I just don't know why I'm here.
My parents are still with us and they say the same thing all the time.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Like there's a limit,
Yeah.
right? And especially when you've been so diminished that you can't actually do the things that you'd like to do, yeah. That's how life is.
Well,
I don't know where are you going next, Jess? Because
where am I going next?
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm going to be talking to Nate. I hope it's going to be after a few weeks because I'm going to be tied up for another 2 weeks or 3.
Oh,
but
okay.
I'm going to be talking to him about this courtly love idea. And there's a little connection of this notion of authenticity that you've brought from Job that really has been important in my interpretation of Job in terms of this, that there has to be a manifestation of authentic faith, and Job is an example, the example of how that can be manifest, if you will.
And how do you see that in connection to courtly love? I'm curious.
Well, it's a little. I'm going to get us going in a weird direction, but
okay.
Courtly love is this deal where there's this pure experience of a connection between the lovers, and it's recognized immediately in a subjective sense as pure, and yet it has to be in a context of it being forbidden love, because if it's not forbidden, then it's not authentic. In other words, if it's not essentially even transgressive. So this is a very different idea, and I'm sorry to kind of take a right turn out of this conversation, but
everything is connected.
Yeah, everything is connected. But it has to be it's got to be Guinevere and Lancelot, because it can't be Arthur and Guinevere.
Well, it's like you have to risk something, right? There has to be a risk involved.
Yeah. And so that in essence, that makes it authentic, or that is why it's authentic. And that's why it's so powerful. And it's also why it's so dangerous. And so anyway.
That's really good. Well, I can't wait to hear that. Well, there's this strange thing in Job. I've mentioned it before, but even when I was talking about the Leviathan and the foundations of the world. So God's speech starts with the foundations of the world, which is like the rational, logical, and we move to the Leviathan. Let's say it's the emotional. Job's whole progression of speeches goes the opposite direction. It starts out with Leviathan and the emotional, the lament, and then he slowly builds confidence up until he makes his negative confession, which is just a totally logical, rational, very heartfelt, very like it's birthed out of his emotion, but his whole thing goes the other way. So that's one example, but there's a bunch other that I've stumbled across where Job has this pattern that is basically the inverse of the pattern that we see God's speech have. And so it's apophatic. Job is like this negative image, and God has the positive image or something like that, and they're meant to come together. It's very
I like that.
masculine, feminine. It's very it's super like I forget what drew my attention to it at the beginning, but I've started to notice this here and there more and more, not just with small things, but like with these bigger themes, like that it's truly like an intimate coming together between Job and God. And
I really like that. I had an idea in that area, which is, again, it's one of these ideas that I'm ready to say I'm not fully committed to, but nonetheless. And that is that Job's, that again, this goes to my thought that God is needing something in this. And what he needs is, he needs this authentic faith that we've talked about. And I'm just going to throw this out there. I don't know how it'll land, but I'll throw it out there anyway. What God needs is our forgiveness. That is to say, he needs Job to carry this burden and say that it was worth it, because God is in pain over his creation. And it's a parent who has a child who's suffering. And you need to know that in some sense it was okay. It was all right.
Mm.
And you need to hear that from the child, because otherwise it's intolerable to produce that pain.
Right.
I think that's what George MacDonald's getting at in his Voice of Job sermon. That how does he put that, Jess? God's
Making a claim
greatest.
on God.
Yeah, but he says he has a line in there that God's greatest claim on us
is that we would
we would make a claim on him, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I personally don't like the God needs something language.
Right. Yeah.
Because I actually think I've talked to Jess about this too.
I've said that twice, and I know I know how it lands, but a lot of people something for me that's important. Yeah.
I think so. I think it does, and I think I know why it bothers me, and it doesn't bother you. It doesn't bother Jess, and it doesn't bother a lot of other people to say that, because I think it's a masculine feminine thing, actually.
Mm.
Because I think men experience that as a way of being in the world, that they need something, right? Because they have something that it's designed to fill a space. Okay. I just try to, tiptoe through the tulip.
I'll let that go. I'll let it go, Shari. Don't worry.
And, Jess said to me in this conversation we had about it, he said, yeah, but a woman has a lack too, because she has a womb. And I'm like, a womb is a lack? Well, it's a space. And I'm like, yeah, but it's full of potential for a woman. A lack would be not having a womb. Okay, that would be a lack, but having an empty womb is nothing. Like, it's not a lack for a woman, and I don't know. I just find it an interesting thing to think about. And I'm not saying one side is right and the other side is wrong. I think these things have to come together, like everything does, right? But for women, space is potential. Okay? That's why women are good at hospitality. That's why they're good at making a home, right? They go about making a home. They make a nest, right? They, the last couple months of pregnancy are just like, nesting, right? And there's nothing there. But for her, it's not about whether or not the space is full. It's potential, right? It's potentially fillable, something like that. And so, and this is what Mary does with Jesus at the wedding at Cana. She opens up the door to his big, huge space, right? His ministry. She says, there's no more wine. And I always think of her being, like the husband would be like, oh, why is she nagging? And she could say, I didn't nag. I just asked you a question, or I just mentioned something. And that's what women do. They create these potentials, right? These spaces. They open it up to, and for them, that is not a lack. Anything can happen there, and it will. Anyway, I just had to throw that in there because, and I don't want to discourage men from talking about need, because I think that's part of the conversation too. But I did want to add my thoughts on it.
I think it's so I think it's so hilarious because it's almost the the idea that men would feel a lack and women don't is exactly the opposite of what like the psychoanalysts say is basically like a woman is a castrated man, and then she has this lack that the man doesn't, whatever. But you phrase it exactly the opposite. I actually like your way better.
Well, there's no hospitality if a woman doesn't see a space as potential. Okay? Just think about that. There's no such thing as hospitality. And that is a very important role of the feminine, okay, is to provide hospitality. And so, I mean, yeah, I won't say anymore now, but yeah. I think at least that's how I perceive it as a woman. I perceive a space as potential, right? So,
yeah. And I was, like, as I was making this video, I actually pulled a clip from it. It's Rabbi. I can't remember his name.
Is it Manus Friedman?
Whoever, yeah, I think so. Whoever that was in the video that I just made.
It looked like Rabbi Manus Friedman.
Yeah, I think that's right. And he said, if anything can be denied from you, you don't need it. So whatever can possibly be denied from you, you don't need. So food, it can be denied to you, you don't need it. You don't even need air and oxygen because you can be thrown into space or whatever. You can be denied, you can be suffocated. He's like, so you don't need anything. This is how he's talking. And he's trying to make a point. He's being a little bit honoring.
Hyperbolic.
And yeah, but his whole thing is like, I don't need anything. Who needs something? Well, God needs something. And what does he need? He needs something from you. And so it throws this like, it's such a interesting move. Like Zizek likes Lacan, the psychoanalyst, and Lacan always does this with the big other. Like you don't have to worry about what your desires are. You need to worry about what you think the desires are of the other. Like that's where your desires are manifest. It's always through the other. And then so the big other is the whatever, the father figure, the God figure. And then like whatever you think he wants, that's what really motivates you. And if you think he is angry at you and thinks that you think that he hates you and all this stuff, then that's how you'll act. And what you have to do, like, I think Lacan wanted to get rid of the big other. Like that's, and Zizek talks about in it, like when Christ dies, it's not a representative of God dying. It's the other dies. And then now we're left with just ourselves. And then you can, whatever. I think,
and you can fall into nihilism.
Huh?
Then you can fall into nihilism and
well, that's the thing is like, but the way Zizek talks about it, it's there's an unspoken hope in it.
Okay.
And because like you just sense it. You can't talk about it though. And this is that weird thing. And this is my experience. And I've said this before. But like when I was in my Christian evangelical upbringing, you talked about faith and the confessions and your hope. You never talked about doubts. You weren't allowed to talk about doubts because it was too risky. You would risk your salvation if you doubted. And then as I like was dealing with that, I ran into like Peter Rollins and Zizek, and these people were all influenced with Lacan and stuff. And so then the doubt actually became the thing that will kind of set you free from this negative concept of whatever the big other was, which was actually helpful because whatever, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But you have doubt, you talk about your doubts, but you can't talk about your hopes. It's always sort of unspoken. And you can see how that, I don't know, it's that weird thing is like whatever's unspoken kind of has more power than the thing that is actually like said. So like I always found like listening to Zizek and Rollins and stuff, while it was kind of like this, Zizek especially like a path to nihilism, there was always this unspoken hope that I sensed, and I was like, I like that. And then like in certain, not all environments, because some of them were very good, but my evangelical upbringing, sometimes there was this spoken hope and this joy, but the undercurrent of it was just like not good. And you couldn't say anything about it. Otherwise you were being, a troublemaker or whatever. And so I found that there has to be
a rose fire.
Yeah, I was just feeling listening to you, Jess. And I listened to Rollins and Zizek myself, and I'm not sure I got the exact impression you're talking about, but hearing you talk there, it really felt to some degree in the same neighborhood as the way I'm feeling about that. I mean, at the end when Job is accepting, he's falling down in dust and ashes. There's a kind of, he's saying it's all okay. It's okay. Leviathan is there. He's looking right at me, but it's okay. And saying
Like
that it's okay, he's saying that to God. He's saying that to God. He's not saying, and that then is rectifying the relationship, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people frame that whole thing in terms of like free will, and I find the whole thing sort of sterile and lifeless when they're like, God needs your free will in order for you to show love towards him. Right. And that, like, it's this whole systematic thing, and like that has no impact on me. But when you were just a minute ago, we're saying like God needs you to tell him that you're all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother level of like, because it's that whole existential thrownness. Like, you didn't ask to be born, and you can rightly just say, "Hey, I didn't ask for this. What are you going to
say?" Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And you can be full of resentment and be like the prodigal son or whatever, and just be like, "Give me my inheritance. I'm going to just go do some things," and you can just saw it off or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hey, seems like you heard what I was trying to say there. So that's good. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's like, I think there's a path through that is, I don't know, at least it's meaningful for me. Like, I get it.
Well, I think you're talking about sonship, right? What it means to be a son. And I think that's what a lot of people forget, unfortunately, that, like I've said this to Jess many times, Jesus said, I have come to show you the Father, right? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. It seems to me that was the purpose of his ministry, was to reveal the Father to us, right? And what does that mean? Well, it means we're children of God, children, sons and daughters, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why George MacDonald can say God's greatest claim on us is that we make a claim of him, because he wants us to see him as the Father, right? Mm-hmm. And as his children, we have a claim on him, right? So, and maybe that's what you mean when you say God needs something, Yeah.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah. Well,
again, I would just want to thank both of you for what you did there. And I all that time you guys spent, I mean, goodness sakes. What a good product and a good,
thank you,
worthy thing you've done.
Thank you.
I'm amazed I still keep getting comments on it.
Yeah.
People keep commenting. Like,
it was a wonderful journey with, like, I felt like Jess and I were like traipsing through the woods, just having this wonderful conversation, stumbling over stones and doing things like that. But it felt like we could just talk about anything, and we weren't under any pressure to say the right thing.
And the other thing, this little corner that you can go to that, where just think of all the glorious people at a kind of common people that have shown themselves to a group that can, kind of connect. It's
great.
It is.
Yeah.
Great.
That's one of the most. I
count you two as two of them.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. But like, just the breadth and width of people from different, like, everyone is so like got their own stuff, and it's all so interesting, and everyone wants to, but we all have this thing in common. So who knows, man?
And they don't have to be coming from, a graduate school or a seminary or whatever. That's
no.
You get amazed with with, like Sam is just I don't know, you guys, I don't know how much you listen to him, but he is just a smart, articulate guy.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so,
world
and there
class.
are others too, but I just pick him out because
Yeah. It's a special place here. And I feel privileged to be part of it, actually.
Yeah, me
I'm
too.
going to, believe it or not, I am going to Amsterdam next week
Oh, nice.
for a family trip, but also works thing. And I'm going to meet with Job over there.
Oh,
So
cool.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Speaking of Job.
Speaking,
So that'll be fun.
That's great.
that's super awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, I'm going to end the recording here. Thanks so much, Shari and Dr. Jim. And until next time, hopefully we'll do this again.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
I'm going to just listen to you guys, and then I'll pick little quotes out, and I'll go to T.S. Eliot, and I'll make my own little videos, and we'll see how that works.
Dude, I loved your T.S. Eliot.
That's great. I love it. I like getting the feedback. It's really great. Really great.
Thanks.